All right. So last week I talked about kind of core booting and setting up a variety of different things on my ThinkPad T530. And this week is going to be kind of the follow-up to that. I'm not going to spend too much time kind of recapping what we talked about last week. You can go watch last week's video if you are interested in the core boot process, the Ivy Rain exploit, or any of the other things that I may talk about in there. Today we're going to be focusing on my experiences since then with FreeBSD on my ThinkPad. I guess the kind of first thing that we should probably talk about was the install process. And honestly, the only issues that I ran into here were totally my own fault. So the FreeBSD installer, once I got it working, was a great experience, but let's just talk a little bit about what went wrong. The default Seabios image that comes with both the Skulls coreboot and the base kind of coreboot payloads for the ThinkPad T530, and I imagine similar Ivy Bridge devices, all suffer the kind of same issues. Seabios has an issue with the VGA out kind of driver that some of these, I don't know if it's a newer or older BIOS, like boot menu kind of thing, but there's just some kind of like incompatibility with the way that the FreeBSD installer switches from the kind of greet screen into the actual install. On the core booted ThinkPad, it was pretty rough. If I tried to launch it in text-only mode, nothing would happen. The screen would just blank. And then if I tried to launch it just normally, it would just be like this thin ribbon atop the screen, and that just wasn't very usable. I kind of had to get crafty here before I eventually just kind of got brave enough to do the kind of updates that I needed to my actual core boot image to get the installer working. I tried to go into my Arch Live USB and install QEMU and then try and run the FreeBSD installer in text mode on QEMU, and then have the target be the partition that I created for BSD. This worked, and I really don't know why I didn't see this coming, but believe it or not, it was not just an issue isolated in the live image that I was having with the display. It was rooted in the kind of entire post-boot handshake. And so despite having gone through the install process now and, done all of that work, I still had the same problem. And now it was actually installed. It wasn't just happening on the USB. So that was kind of annoying. That was a bit of a setback. And that was definitely when I realized that I was just going to have to kind of lock in and do the core boot the right way, which was, like I talked about in the last video, kind of gathering the kind of necessary drivers from the stock BIOS, building them into the core boot image, and that took a little bit of playing around with. I got the like graphics drivers from the Lenovo BIOS without issue. I had to change some settings here and there. I eventually ended up giving up. I was trying to get a boot splash going for kind of the longest time. Not really, it was only a couple of hours, but I was trying to get a boot splash kind of set up, and I never got to a point where I was happy with it. And I ended up just getting rid of it entirely. Now we're just booting text only mode. But the most important thing is that we have the necessary drivers to support the FreeBSD installer at this point. So once I had kind of sorted all of that stuff out, actually installing FreeBSD was awesome. I mean, I don't want to be like dramatic. It was just an installer for an operating system, but I felt like it was a really nice middle ground, especially for me not having used ABSD before. It was just like an ncurses style kind of guided menu, had nice explanations for anything that I felt like needed them, and everything else that was kind of self-explanatory was easy to walk through. I appreciated this because, lacking the background for BSD, I probably wouldn't have been ready to do this completely manually. I mean, I guess if I had the wiki open on my other computer, it wouldn't have been an issue. But, the installer was definitely welcome. I thought it was nice that it was like just kind of an end curses menu and not like a full GUI. I really like the way that this all works, and I think that they cover everything really well. This isn't really much different than setting up Linux. I mean, it's a lot of the same kind of considerations. The biggest departure, I would say, is probably when you're setting up your package management. I think this might be new with FreeBSD 15, but you now have a choice between distribution sets and packages. And I don't really know how this works. I think distribution sets are like you pick a set of like software that's going to be on there, and that's just what you have. Um, Packages is like, you use the package installer. Just about everyone that I saw online to go with packages. And so I went with packages, and I think that that's just kind of the more standard experience where you use your package manager in the command line to collect packages. I might be wrong. If you know more about that, then please let me know down below, because I'm very new to this all and still figuring this out. Post install, it's just, the same thing that you expect anywhere else. Once everything concludes, which can take a little while depending on how you configure things, I toggled a couple of the optional kind of install options, and so mine ended up sitting for a little while. I was actually sitting in class while this was happening, and I lucked out. It finished right before I had to go. And I also didn't realize at the time, but I hadn't been properly plugged into the wall. And I realized when I next rebooted that we had about 7% battery left. So things were very close to being like really inopportune, kind of everything about it. But it worked out, and it was really, really nice. Getting actually into BSD was pretty cool. It honestly kind of worked out in my favor. I was in the process of losing and getting new internet in the kind of days following finally getting through into FreeBSD. And so this gave me a great opportunity to spend a couple afternoons just kind of like exploring the file system, reading man pages, things like that. And it really helped me kind of like get a feel for, I guess, some of the things that I think are going to ultimately stick with me as differences between FreeBSD and Linux. And I won't go too far into any of them because I'm definitely not like an expert. But one of the things that stood out to me very quickly, and I'm not trying to make any like bold statements here, but the quality of the man pages on FreeBSD were excellent. I think that there's a lot of great man pages on Linux, and I'm sure that there's a lot of man pages that overlap and they're identical. But the basic ones like man hire for like, file system hierarchy kind of stuff, really, really cool ways to just quickly kind of start to understand your system, move around, and just kind of get a feel for things. Everything is like kind of concise, direct, and just written in a way that's very digestible. So if you have questions and you're in the mood to kind of read the docs, the man pages on FreeBSD are great. I think another thing that really stood out to me was kind of the way that FreeBSD handles memory. It's definitely different than what is going on with Linux. I haven't done a proper deep dive into like what is actually happening here, but what I will say from my experience thus far is it uses more memory than Arch does, using a kind of similar kind of setup. And I believe the reason for this, I've seen this in a couple of places now, and I think it's kind of a BSD-ism, which is that unused memory is wasted memory. And so I think what BSD tries to do is increase the life cycle of memory on your system. And it does this by creating kind of additional resource pools or stages of life. I honestly don't think that I could rattle them off the top of my head right now, but it's essentially like a recycling system. There's, unused, like completely, totally free, never before seen. And then there's like active memory, and then there's stuff that's being like cleaned. There's stuff that's being like saved for later. I think there's reserved. Like there's a lot going on here. And I think the idea is that, just whereas Linux is like mostly reporting on like how much memory is being used in real time, and I think the way that it allocates and deallocates is probably more aggressive than what's going on here. I think BSD tries to use more RAM and then optimize the way that it kind of controls it, shares it. I don't really know. This is another thing where if any of you guys are more knowledgeable on this than I am, I would love to kind of learn more in the comments. But it's something that I'm gonna do my own research on independently one way or another. But I definitely thought it was interesting. At first, I thought that there was, something going on. I had gone kind of wrong somewhere in my setup and built a heavier system than I had expected, but I realized that, a lot of my processes were using very familiar amounts of resources. It really was just having to do with the way that those things were being reported. So the package management in FreeBSD is pretty interesting, and I think it's probably the last kind of specific feature that I'll take note of here before we move on. And just generally, I thought it was pretty cool. All the paradigms and usage are very, very much what you'd expect from package management, but there's a couple things that are kind of unique to FreeBSD or otherwise just different from Linux. And I think one of the biggest ways that it differs is there's kind of like three kind of main areas of packages that we're going to be dealing with here. And those come in the form of your kind of core FreeBSD packages. They come in the form of the FreeBSD ports, and they come in the form of just emulated, well, yeah, emulated Linux software. And so these are all, at their core, interfaced with and interacted with, downloaded through the package manager. But they all have kind of their own sources, and in the case of the Linux stuff, their own kind of usage associated with them. But I think it's a very powerful thing that rather than kind of isolating these and creating all these different kinds of systems for doing these different things, they figured out how to kind of unify this into one solution. And I think that they did so in a pretty elegant way. The ports, for me, I set them up during the FreeBSD installer. I think that's part of the reason why my install took so long. I might be mistaken here, but my understanding of the ports is that there is a GitHub repository for user FreeBSD ports, and it's, kind of something akin to the AUR. I'm not trying to compare the two. I'm just kind of, I guess, in the sense of the community repository sense. And so, yeah, it is stuff that has been ported to be now native on FreeBSD, but it's not part of the core catalog. This is a pretty expansive list, and there's a lot of stuff that you can get on here. If you include this through the installer, I believe it just clones the repo for you ahead of time. You can always do this if you do not already have them. I forget, I think it's like user share ports or user ports, something like that. You just go into there, and like I said, it's a GitHub repository. You clone it down, and then now you just have access to more packages. You can also go within all of those and actually just build them yourself. So, you have options, but the general idea here is that you have more software that's available to you now. And the final, kind of piece of that I mentioned earlier is the Linux emulation stuff. I don't even know if I want to call it Linux emulation. I feel like I've already misspoken in saying that. I mean, the kind of like common term for the kind of stack here is the Linuxulator, but effectively we have like just Linux binaries running, my understanding, near natively through just translation rather than like true emulation or virtualization. Like it is just creating like symlinks or otherwise, propagating the directories that Linux looks for to installing the same prerequisites and kind of tool chains, and things are running. in my case, really the only thing that I'm using the Linux emulation for is VS Code. FreeBSD and Electron seem to have a kind of long-standing feud here, and at the time that I'm recording this, I'm still unable to just get a build for Codium, CodeOSS, VS Code, whichever one might be available on there. I can't do it. So I caved and I set up the Linux emulation stuff. I wanted to do this anyway, but this ended up being like the good reason to do it. I was a little nervous because, VS Code is an Electron app. I hadn't used this before. I didn't know if the performance was going to be good. I didn't really, know anything about this. But honestly, I've been really pleased with the kind of whole experience here. Now that we're kind of done talking about some of those kind of specific quirks or kind of features of FreeBSD that stood out to me, we can talk about my setup a little bit. You've probably seen it going in the background here. I'm just trying to keep things simple. It's a COM window manager on X11, and we're using XComp manager as our compositor. This kind of stack of things was not essential, but I wanted to be like just very minimal, lightweight, kind of intentional about this setup. COM Window Manager is a piece of OpenBSD software, and it has been ported over to FreeBSD. This has been really nice. I use tiling window managers like 99% of the time. So this whole stacking business has been cool. The kind of keyboard first nature of it all while still integrating the mouse has definitely been fun and makes a lot of sense for a laptop. But I could also totally see using this on a desktop, to be super honest with you. I've been very surprised at how kind of open-minded I was able to be with this setup. I think it just looks really nice. XComp Manager has been great. I just wanted to keep everything as light as possible. So I went with, the basic of basic, just to do light shadows, simple like fade, transition effect kind of thing. And I've been very happy with it. The whole thing is kind of themed around solarized light right now, and my background, I just threw it together in GIMP. I did that on device. That was kind of how I was testing to see how GIMP performed. I just wanted to grab like as much software that I could that I had a kind of benchmark for its performance from Linux on this machine, so I could compare it. And again, I mean, everything was just good. I was able to do all the same kinds of edits using the same kinds of effects and filters that I was in Linux with little to no issue. The GIMP install here is native once again to FreeBSD. That's going to be a kind of like running trend. I was really surprised by this. I expected to find more software that I was going to have to emulate, and it just didn't really come around that much. There were some AWS command line tools that I could not get natively working. I found some kind of hacky workaround guides that supposedly worked, but I couldn't get them functional. But that's kind of neither here nor there. Those were just some things for class that I wanted to challenge myself to get working on FreeBSD. For those, I opted to go down the Linux emulation route because it's just simpler. For the most part, AWS in the command line is a bunch of Python scripts anyway. There's just, I think, a couple binaries, and they don't support BSD. I just didn't feel like, dealing with the headache. Either way, that was just kind of a fun thing to get going, just to see how all that worked and kind of prove to myself that I still knew how to do it after setting it up the first time. But yeah, my time on FreeBSD has been great so far, and I think moving forward, I just want to keep trying to learn as much as I can about FreeBSD as a system, and I mean, more importantly, as an operating system, kind of continuing to see what it is like to use it, maintain it, work in it, and yeah, I'm excited to just kind of see how that keeps going. I plan to continue using it in the same way that I have been. I'm going to try and just, for as many tasks as it seems responsible, I'll try and, get it out and put it to work. Uh, as for what's next, I'm not really sure yet. I now have kind of most of the software set up that I'm curious to try, and I have a good feel for what using a FreeBSD system is like. I think that I'm going to continue to kind of keep using it for as many things as it makes sense and kind of feels responsible to do so with. This was kind of more of a curiosity thing. And now that I've kind of gotten it out of my system, it, just kind of feels like another computer. I'm looking forward to continue using it and kind of getting settled in, learning about FreeBSD. I guess kind of the closing note that I'll leave you guys with is another question for any potential BSD experts that may see this video. FreeBSD experts to be specific. I believe that I've made that mistake more than once in kind of generalizing to BSD as a whole. I don't know how much of that you can actually do. It's really not my intention. It's more of a slip of the tongue kind of thing. So yeah, that's going to be just about it for me and FreeBSD today. I appreciate you guys for sticking around to the end of the video. If you enjoyed what you saw today, please consider leaving a like. And if you're new here, consider dropping a sub. I've been doing this for a couple months now. I'm really enjoying the YouTube grind, and any little bit of support that you can muster up for me helps me a absolute ton. I'm going to be streaming some game development stuff. I'm starting a new game that I'm very excited about. I've already started a little bit of preliminary work, and I'm looking forward to getting back on the streams, doing some Godot stuff. We're going to have some devlogs coming out for that, probably starting next week. And otherwise, just kind of, keep your eye out for the usual Godot content, Linux content, that kind of thing. I may or may not have another ThinkPad on the way, and that could be interesting. So, either way, that's all I got. See you next time.